Welcome to AlexGs Aquarium, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about getting the calcium reactor running on the 1600 gallon system. If you didn't see last week's video, I suggest you go check it out. I revealed the calcium reactor that I'm putting onto the 1600 gallon system. It's a Geo's Reef calcium reactor with a primary and secondary chamber. Also picked up a carbon doser, CO2 regulator. And I want to talk a little bit about this reactor and how I set it up. I think there's some good tips that everybody can benefit from, especially when they're not familiar with setting up a calcium reactor, such as me. This is my first calcium reactor that I have ever had. I've seen them in operation before, and they work on a fairly simple concept, which is you put a media inside them that dissolves at a low pH, and you use that liquid, or affluent as they call it, supply your tank with calcium, bicarbonate alkalinity, or just carbonate, and then also it will supply magnesium, strontium, and a bunch of other trace elements depending on the type of media that you keep in your calcium reactor. I'm going to go through a little bit on what I use for media. I'm also going to talk about all the different things I did to set this calcium reactor up today. Now, the very first thing I had to do before I could get this calcium reactor up and running was to do some preliminary water testing. I ran water through the calcium reactor for several days before I even attempted to load media into it. And it's a good idea anytime that you get something that's a new piece of plumbing equipment that's going to have water running through it, that's not sitting in a sump tank. And even if it is sitting in a sump tank, it might be a good idea to just run it for a few days without putting anything else onto it or relying on it as a piece of equipment immediately. I also made sure that on the shelf that I put it on, I lined it with multiple layers of heavy 6mm plastic. This is more just for a safety measure where if there is a leak, it's not going to get all over the painted shelves and then drip back into the tank, which might cause some form of contamination. Another thing that you should always kind of think about when you place things around your aquarium. Now, to get water flow into this calcium reactor, I tapped into the Jabo return pump that is feeding my UV sterilizer and the refuge tank. It was pretty simple. I just cut the pipe between a couple of unions, I added a T, and I put a 1/4 inch John Guest fitting onto it with a little ball valve to control the flow, just so I could turn it on and off to the reactor. Now, it did take quite a while to fill this reactor up. It does not need an extremely heavy amount of water flow into it. As we'll get into this a little later, it's just a drip rate or a slow flow rate out of the calcium reactor. So once I had a water source ready for the calcium reactor, I set it in and I connected the 1/4 inch John Guest fittings with the water line, which connects into the recirculation pump line of the calcium reactor along the back side of what faces me in the fish room. Now, it took quite a while to fill the reactor up. Once it fills the reactor up, it will flow out of the reactor through a little micro valve that feeds the secondary chamber. The secondary chamber gets the water entering through the bottom, and it comes out the top and ultimately drains back into the 1600 gallon system. Once I was done with just water testing the calcium reactor, went ahead and drained it using the drain valve that's located in the back of the recirculation plumbing. This allowed me to simply just open a valve and have a little piece of vinyl hose connected, which drained the water back into the tank. Now, when this calcium reactor is up and running, of course, you don't want to just open that valve and drain whatever's in it into your system, as it's likely going to have a low pH and a very high dose of alkalinity calcium to it, which could be detrimental to your reef depending on your levels or how quickly it will change it. Once the reactor was drained, it was time to go ahead and fill it up with media. When I did inquire about this reactor with Geo's Reef, I did ask how they would set it up ideally for the 1600 gallon system, or just in general how they would like to see it set up. And they said they would use 3 different types of media. 2 of those were from 2 Little Fishes. One of them was the Reborn media, and Reborn is a pretty interesting media. It's fossilized coral skeletons that are sustainably gathered, and essentially it is what corals are made out of. So as it gets dissolved, it can help to be reborn as live corals again, and because it's sustainably sourced, it's not causing any kind of harm to the environment, which is always a good thing. Now the Remag is a Two Little Fishes product as well, and it is to help maintain magnesium levels in your tank. They look like little white stones, and they just required a little bit of a rinse before they got put into the reactor. The reborn media was already pre-washed and did not require any kind of extra washing or cleaning before it went into the reactor chamber itself. And I did the 90% reborn to 10% Remag math, and then I just took that amount of Remag and I kind of scattered it around the reactor as I filled it up to the top. I also made sure that I made a little impression in the top of the media that would allow me to put a pH probe into the reactor once it was online. A secondary chamber I filled with carob seed arm fine grain media. And the secondary chamber, of course, is there to help neutralize the pH of the effluent that's coming out of the main reactor chamber before it goes into the tank. Now, both of these medias I know are widely used and well accepted in the reef community, so I decided to go on their recommendation and put in the Two Little Fishes medias and also the carob seed arm medias. And I gotta say, it was a very interesting thing to fill them up. It was even more fun to pick the reactor up once it was full of media and put it in place on that shelf back there. It wasn't too bad. I don't think I'd want to try that with it filled with media and water though, because it'd probably just be way too heavy to pick up the primary chamber that way. And once I got the media in place and all the water lines in place again, I ran water through the reactor for about a week. With water flow through the calcium reactor and it full of media, the next step was to get the carbon doser set up with a CO2 cylinder. Now I'll talk a little bit more about CO2 cylinders in a minute, but first I want to talk about what you do with the carbon doser when you get it. Now the very first thing you should do with the carbon doser is, of course, read the instructions, and the first steps that they have you take is a bleed down test. And now this makes sure that the regulator doesn't have any kind of leaks in it. You simply attach the regulator to your CO2 tank. Then you ensure that the pressure knob is closed on the regulator. And you do that by turning it counterclockwise until it does not move anymore. And it's going to be unscrewing it, so it might not seem like the most natural thing to do unless you've had a little bit of experience with regulators. That's how you close them. Now they have you do this so that it doesn't cause the pressure from the tank to get into the lower pressure side of the regulator, which if it's exposed to too much pressure could damage the internal workings. And then open your CO2 cylinder, let it pressurize, which mine went to about 850 psi. I then closed the CO2 valve and I marked the pressure gauge with a piece of blue tape and let it sit for 15 minutes. Now this ensures that the connection between the regulator and the CO2 tank and the regulator itself do not have any CO2 leaks. Once I had that completed, I moved the CO2 tank into position, which is behind the calcium reactor on the shelf. Now the CO2 tank I went with is a 20-pound steel cylinder. It's what they had available at Airgas. And I actually leased this cylinder instead of purchasing it. They had rent, lease, and buy options. I went with a lease for 1 year on this tank, which was $90. And that allows me to bring the tank back anytime I want in that year, or simply just pay for a refill. Now you might be asking, why did I lease this cylinder as opposed to making a purchase? And really it came down to not knowing exactly how much CO2 consumption I'm going to have on the 1600 gallon system. I elected to go with the 20-pound, and optionally, if I needed to scale up, which if I needed to scale up is a rather large cylinder at a 55-pound capacity, and the cylinder itself weighs well over 100 pounds, and it would not be able to fit on that shelf, but I wanted to have the option to get another size cylinder. But if I don't, ultimately I'll probably just purchase these tanks. I'm going to get a second one in the next couple of months. I really want to see how long these CO2 tanks last before I go ahead and swap them out constantly. And I also note that if you are going to purchase a CO2 tank and you're going to do it outside of the facility, you're going to get it filled, you might want to check with them whether or not they're going to fill it. Sometimes they'll outright refuse to fill tanks that are not from their facility or they're a brand they know. You could also get charged for hydro testing, which certifies that the tank can't hold pressure. Just a fair word of warning, you just want to make sure you have the right CO2 cylinder. before you try and purchase one or get it filled. And it was a little unknown to me whether or not the carbon doser regulator would fit on most CO2 tanks or if that was a special valve connection. Ultimately though, it was just a standard connection that's used on most CO2 tanks, so it shouldn't be a problem on whatever you get. It's very important too that you secure your CO2 cylinder in place. I used a couple of giant zip ties, just hold it in place so it can't tip over. Reason that you want to do that is, one, it could damage or break your regulator if it were to fall over. The other problem is if it falls over and it snaps a valve stem or a piece of the regulator that's holding the full tank pressure, you're going to have 850 pounds of force blowing out of that cylinder, and despite that cylinder weighing 50 or 60 pounds, it will start moving on its own and potentially fly all over the place, causing a lot of damage if not an injury. Make sure you take a little time to just take your CO2 bottles and put them in a secure place so they can't fall over and potentially cause some real problems and headaches for you. And once I got the CO2 system hooked up into the tank and the tank in place, went ahead and connected the CO2 lines. Now the carbon doser is pretty simple. It's an electronic regulator and it has just a little knob. Now the control knob on the carbon doser controls how many bubbles get released in a specific time frame. You can go from like 1 bubble per 10 seconds all the way down to multiple bubbles per second. You also can control the bubble size by controlling the pressure on the regulator. The more pressure you add, the more carbon dioxide will be able to escape when that little valve opens and closes. It's a really nice concept, and I look forward to using it to help me dial in the calcium reactor. Now, of course, you've got to have some controls on a calcium reactor. It's important to understand the pH inside of it. If it gets too low, it can turn your media into sludge, and it will not be something that's good for your tank at all. It could also drastically lower the pH of your tank if something were to not be monitored properly. Now I'm using my pH probe in place of my ORP probe. I don't really look at the ORP all that much. I'm not running ozone, and while it is an interesting statistic to look at in the apex, I think it's more important to monitor the pH of the calcium reactor. So I put that pH probe in there. I also added a solenoid valve to the apex running off one of the DC ports on the energy bar. Now this solenoid valve is going to be a backup redundancy to shutting off the carbon doser. I'm going to use the internal pH of the calcium reactor to determine whether or not the carbon doser remains on, and if the solenoid valve that's down the line from the carbon doser remains opened or closed. That way, if the pH gets too low and there's some kind of malfunction, it'll hopefully stop the flow of CO2 gas, unless there's some kind of leak, of course. But it's going to be another level of control so that I can see what's going on inside the calcium reactor. I think this is a really good redundant setup. I know I talked about the solenoid valve on a previous video to see if anyone guessed it. Didn't really see a whole lot in the way of guesses that went for that, but there were some interesting ones out there. Now that I have the calcium reactor up and running, I'm going to be going into the dial-in period to get this reactor up to speed so that it can keep up with the alkalinity, calcium, magnesium consumption in the 1600 gallon system. And I fully expect this process to take at least a couple of weeks. I want to take this slow. I am not going to be trying to, tank the pH inside the reactor down to 6.5 within a day. I have got the carbon doser set up to dispense bubbles on a very slow setting every 10 seconds or so, and then I also have the pressure on it turned down a little bit so it's not putting a ton of CO2 into it right now. I want to see how that gets affected. I also have the affluent draining out into the refuge tank for a couple of reasons. One, I want to be able to see the drops per second coming out of it, and it's a very easy place to get that visual, because I'm always looking at it every day. pH coming out of this calcium reactor, even through the secondary chamber, is likely going to be a little lower than the rest of the tank and still have some carbon dioxide in it. My hope is, by putting that into the 150 gallon refuge tank, that affluent will help to provides CO2 to the macroalgae growing in there and the regular algae growing in there, which should really help to boost nutrient export in the 150-gallon refuge tank. Again, there's going to be some trial and error with this, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on it. The big thing is I don't want the pH inside my whole system to start drastically being lowered. If it does have a big effect and it's detrimental and I start seeing problems with the corals, at that point I'm probably going to start looking at some other options to raise my pH in the 1,600-gallon system. There's plenty of them out there. It's just a matter of setting something up that would help boost my pH a little bit in this tank without causing any kinds of problem. Now, this is my first calcium reactor. I'm really looking forward to sharing the journey of using this calcium reactor as I start to add more and more corals and increase the demand of these essential elements to the tank. If you have any comments or questions on the calcium reactor or the 1,600-gallon system in general, go ahead and leave them down below. Of course, if you like today's video, please go ahead, give me that thumbs up. Let me know that you like the content. If you want to see more on the 1,600-gallon system and its journey, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I will see you on the next video.